Author and intimacy expert Laura M. Brotherson, host of the Marital Intimacy Show, educates and inspires women to create a mutually fulfilling, intimate, and passionate marital relationship, emotionally, spiritually, and sexually.
Hey there! Welcome back to the Marital Intimacy Show. This is Laura Brotherson. Thanks for tuning in today. The topic of this show is Affair-Proofing Your Marriage Part 2, some specific steps. Let's continue. So our next way to affair-proof your marriage is to learn to communicate openly in marriage about anything. Ongoing, honest communication about all marital issues is so important, and we're not talking about just the easy stuff. We're talking about the difficult stuff, like the hurts, the frustrations, the disappointments, etc. And if this is something that is difficult for you or that you haven't been doing very much, then, you may need to start out with some easier stuff or take an easier approach, like communicating a little bit more about these things through writing, like at letters or email. I wouldn't go from no communication to a discussion of preventing affairs. Might be a little bit startling. You might want to just start with sharing more of your thoughts and feelings with each other, and just little by little move beyond surface and superficial into a little bit more depth. One helpful way to do that is a great little book that I often recommend. It's called 365 Questions for Couples by Michael J. Beck. That might be a way to kind of open up a different line of communication for you. Now remember, communication involves not only more effective speaking or sharing of your needs and thoughts and feelings and perspectives, but it also involves learning to listen more fully. To learn to communicate openly and safely with each other, I definitely recommend you learn the couples dialogue that I teach in Chapter 10 of my book, And They Were Not Ashamed. It's basically a 3-step process of learning to first mirror each other as you communicate. This first step is to help you be sure that you understand what the other person is saying before you respond to them. And then the second step is validating, which is basically just trying to get behind, that person's eyes and say, okay, from your perspective, I can see what you're saying and how that might be true for you. I can see how that certain thing makes sense from your perspective. Even if you don't agree, you don't have to agree to still validate someone from their point of view. And then in step 3, you learn to empathize by identifying, now how might it feel to be my spouse after hearing what they've just said? And this is where you would say something like, so I imagine that you might be feeling sad or lonely, if what I hear is correct. And they can say, yeah, that's what I'm feeling. Or, well, no, not exactly that. I'm feeling this. And in the mirroring, in the first step of mirroring, which is probably the most important, even if you can't use all 3, is just to use this statement. So let me just make sure I understand what you're saying before I respond. Are you saying da-da-da? And then they say, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Or they say, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. So then they say something back again, and then you try again. Okay, so are you saying this? And they say, yeah, that's what I'm saying. So you actually have an opportunity to really hear and understand. It's interesting. I had a little bit of a conversation with someone not too long ago, and it was kind of on a little bit of a heated, controversial type of a subject. And I really left the discussion feeling really bad because I thought this is where I should have used, some some dialoguing kind of skills where neither of us, I think, probably felt heard or understood. And I imagine both of us kind of left the conversation feeling kind of unfulfilled and a little bit frustrated. Whereas in the course of the conversation, I should have said, okay, before I'll respond to that, let me just make sure I understand what you're saying. And it just could have kept the conversation a lot less reactive. And that's what you need to do, especially with a subject that you both feel pretty strongly about, and it can be kind of heated or controversial. So in many marriages, couples, they almost learn to be dishonest with each other and not share important information about themselves because of the responses they get. If you or your spouse responds with anger or resentment or the silent treatment or goes into a depression for a few days, the other person will certainly learn not to ever be honest again. So we need to do all that we can to allow our spouse to be honest with us, even if we may not initially like what we're hearing. And the mirroring, the validating, and the empathizing is an important way to be able to do that. We need to also learn to compassionately give and receive constructive feedback. Just think about it. What would you do or say if your spouse mentioned that he or she had felt attracted to someone, like at work or at the gym or whatever? Could you calmly receive that information and even ask some questions about it? Like, well, why do you think you were attracted to that person? Or asking, any kind of question that would give you a chance to kind of glean some information from that for the sake of your marriage. Certainly that could open up a mature discussion of your relationship and meeting each other's needs, and doing this is what can help you remove potential vulnerability in your marriage. That's what we want to do. Remember, we're trying to remove vulnerability and opportunities. So number 3, acknowledge and discuss attractions to others with your spouse. We just kind of alluded to this here. Now, depending on the level of your relationship or how connected you are at the time, you may not want to start with opening up about an attraction you might be feeling to somebody. If you need to work on your relationship a little bit first, you probably want to start with things that are just a little bit more developing the ability to share thoughts and feelings a little bit more deeply than just having kind of a superficial relationship. Certainly these kinds of disclosures need to have a pretty strong relationship already going as your foundation. And still, it doesn't need to be made into a big deal to share that you might thought somebody was attractive or something. It doesn't have to be a big deal. But you may want to spend time just building the relationship before delving into this kind of discussion, is the point I want to make there. This is the same kind of counsel I give to parents who are planning to talk to their kids about sex and such. If the relationship isn't already doing pretty well, then it's best to spend some time and effort building the relationship first before having such discussions. And an important concept related to, sharing attractions with your spouse is this idea of secrecy. Secrecy is to infidelity what sunlight and water is to plants. It simply helps them grow, and without it, they die. You don't want to allow secrecy to be a part of your marriage. This is why it's so important to be able to share an attraction or a temptation with your spouse. Obviously, this takes a healthy level of intimacy to share such information, but this is what also helps you to affair-proof your marriage. How would you even go about discussing attractions with your spouse? How would you accomplish this suggestion? You could say something like, you're listening to this podcast about strengthening marriage, and they talked about how important it is to be able to not have secrecy in your marriage and to share when you might be feeling some attraction to someone, not because it's a big deal, but just to keep the air clear and keep things open. Maybe you could ask them, have you ever felt attracted to anyone, or share an occurrence that you have had. But again, just keep it pretty low key if it's a low key thing. And if you can keep it before it's a big deal, then it's certainly a lot easier to make this a regular part of your relationship if it, when those things come up. One woman shared how she had heard of this idea that couples ought to be open with each other about attractions that either one might experience. And they had some friends that her husband was working with somewhat on a project and felt that, there could be a possibility of feelings there. So one day she kind of teasingly said to her husband, "Now, if you ever start having feelings for so-and-so, I hope you'll let me know." Then she paused, and of course she was smiling, and before she added, "So I can beat her up." And they both laughed. She said, that just set the stage for them to be able to discuss such things without it being too much of a big deal or too intense. And it's important to understand that attractions may occur, but that doesn't mean that you're headed for an affair. It's just, what do you do with it that matters? Just remember, affairs need secrecy in order to happen. So keep the secrecy out of your marriage. You know, my husband and I were talking about this and, just as I was preparing for this podcast, and he kind of said, well, so have you ever felt attracted to anyone? And I was like, and it was a little weird to just think about that concept, because I hadn't really ever even thought about it. And, and to share it, maybe a time or two when I thought there may have been some connection there with somebody. But somehow I noticed that in the process of having that discussion, it really took all the danger and this, kind of steam out of it. And I could certainly see how it would be a protective factor for couples to be able to share this kind of information and help them to avoid inappropriate intimacies. Related to this concept of acknowledging and discussing attractions to others, with your spouse, just keep in mind that if either of you are dealing with any particularly serious stressors in your life, which, we all have at times, sometimes, this can be financial worries or depression or work or family or children stressors, then your susceptibility to the false high, if you will, of someone paying attention to you, that does increase. That increases. So, and keep in mind, it is a false high. Affairs and infidelity are a counterfeit. They're not the real thing. And if you have weaknesses or vulnerabilities, you are more susceptible. So we've mentioned this concept of being aware of extra stressors and the importance of keeping secrecy out of your relationship. These are, great things to keep in mind for affair-proofing your marriage. Stay tuned to the next episode of the Marital Intimacy Show for more tips on protecting your marriage from affairs. This has been episode number 6, Affair-Proofing Your Marriage Part 2, Specific Steps, of the Marital Intimacy Show with Laura M. Brotherson. I hope you got some helpful ideas here. So far, we've talked about 1, being introspective, developing greater self-awareness. 2, being able to communicate openly in marriage about anything. And 3, acknowledging and discussing attractions to others with your spouse. And we'll continue with the rest of the suggestions in the next 2 episodes. I hope you've gleaned some helpful ideas here that can help you affair-proof your marriage. We've talked about 3 particular things. Number 1, being introspective and developing self-awareness. Number 2, being able to communicate openly in marriage about anything. And number 3, acknowledging and discussing attractions to others with your spouse. And then we'll continue with the rest of the suggestions in part 2. So here's your homework. I'd like you to choose just one of the things we've talked about today and start working on it. Just see how it can strengthen your marriage and help you avoid going through the pain of infidelity. I'm all about prevention. I'd much rather we prevent affairs than try to fix them after they occur. Although that happens and that work needs to be done as well. But let's focus on prevention here. So some of the suggestions that you could take on for your homework include 1, work on learning more about yourself and developing greater self-awareness and understanding. Number 2, learn to think more about and do things for others than you do for yourself. Number 3, develop a more personal relationship with God as a protective factor for you. Number 4, learn the couples dialogue that I talked about, that process, and use it for important or, heated kinds of conversations. Number 5, learn to really listen and to share your thoughts and feelings more fully with your spouse. Number 6, determine to keep an open dialogue going that addresses your relationship, each other's needs, and any attractions that might come along. So your second homework here is to share with us your thoughts about this podcast and any additional insights you might have gained about affair-proofing your marriage. You can post them here on our blog so that others can benefit, or you can email them directly to me at Laura, Laura, at strengtheningmarriage.com. I appreciate your comments and questions. And lastly, if this podcast has been helpful to you, I encourage you to share it with others so that we can all work together to strengthen marriages. Well, thanks for tuning in today. I hope you will find great benefit from the things we've discussed today. I especially hope these things will allow you to be more confident in protecting your marriage from infidelity and to enjoy your spouse and your relationship more fully. You can also learn more at our website, www.strengtheningmarriage.com. In our next Marital Intimacy show, we'll continue with the topic of affair-proofing your marriage. We hope you'll be back for more insights and inspiration for strengthening your marriage intimately. Until then, this is Laura Brotherson with the Marital Intimacy Show. Have a great day.